Syllables are groups of one or more sound segments. This video will present an algorithm or set of rules for grouping sound segments into syllables. As it turns out, there's a very predictable pattern that describes how sounds are grouped into syllables. For example, the English word alphabet, transcribed in IPA below, can be broken up into the following three syllables: al, f, and bet. It cannot be divided into syllables any other way, like a, lf, and bet. If you're a native English speaker, this is probably very intuitive for you. However, this algorithm will be useful not only for syllabifying words like alphabet, but also for more complex English words, and for words in other languages that you may not have as strong intuitions about. Let's start by syllabifying the word alphabet, which is transcribed in IPA below. First, we start by identifying the nuclei, which are usually vowels, and we mark that with an N. Then we gather all the consonants preceding each vowel that can form a viable onset. Lf is not a viable onset in English. We can tell because there's no word or possible word that could ever begin with lf. So only the f forms an onset. The b is also a good onset in English. Then all the remaining consonants form codas. So here the l is a coda, and the t is also a coda. Now we group onsets, nuclei, and codas into syllables, and we mark each syllable with a lowercase sigma. Here we have a nucleus and a coda forming a syllable, an onset and a nucleus forming a syllable, and an onset, nucleus, and a coda forming a syllable. Notice that the onset and codas are optional, but the nucleus is never optional. Let's do another word, stratosphere. First we identify the nuclei and label it with an N. Remember that diphthongs like O and E in English are a single phone, and so we mark it with a single line. Next we gather as many consonants preceding each vowel as we can to form an acceptable onset. This is called the maximal onset principle. Stra is a fine onset in English, as is ta. Now here you may be confused about whether sfa is a good onset in English or not. The way to test this is to see if there are any words that begin with sfa, and if so, sfa is a fine onset. Well, in fact, there are two that come to mind, sphere and sphinx, so sfa is a good onset. Next, all remaining consonants become codas, and all we have to do is group onsets, nuclei, and codas into syllables. It's that easy. Not all languages place the same constraints on what forms an acceptable onset and coda. Let's syllabify the word for stratosphere, translated into Spanish, estratosfera. First we identify the nuclei, then we gather all the preceding consonants to form a valid onset. Stra does not form a valid onset in Spanish. We can tell because there's no Spanish word that begins with stra. Even a made-up word that begins with stra does not sound like it could be Spanish. Tra, on the other hand, is a valid onset, as is ta. Sfa is not a valid onset. There is no word in Spanish that begins with sfa. Then we gather all remaining consonants to form codas. So we end up with a syllabification for estratosfera that looks quite different from the syllabification of the word stratosphere, despite the words sharing many of the same segments. The moral of the story is that when syllabifying in any language, the maximal onset principle still applies, but each language places different constraints on what is considered maximal. Lastly, some languages also allow consonants to be the nucleus of a syllable. We call these syllabic consonants and indicate this with a small vertical line under the symbol. These words are syllabified in the same way as other words. First we identify the nuclei, and then we gather as many preceding consonants to form valid onsets. T is not a valid onset, but t is. N becomes the coda. And this is how you syllabify the word mantle.